Good morning. I am Tiffany Huth, Chief Communications Officer here at the Innovation and Value Initiative. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's discussion, Next Step Toward Patient Focus and Value Assessment and Payer Decision Making, co-hosted by IVI and the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation, NEHI. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. First, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, your organization, and where you're dialing in from. Today's webinar is slated for 75 minutes. We will kick things off with a brief presentation, followed by a panel discussion. Then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. We are in a webinar format today, so attendees will be muted and without video. Please utilize the Q&A function in your Zoom options to ask questions of the presenters and moderator, and we will address as many of those as we can during the Q&A portion of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be publicly available on the IVI website. With that, I am pleased to introduce Jennifer Bright, Chief Executive Officer at IVI. Jennifer?
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. Welcome. We are so pleased to see so many of you joining us today for this wonderful conversation. On behalf of IVI and my colleague Tom Hubbard, we're so pleased to be able to bring this webinar forward and to carry forward some of the really important work that both of our organizations held last year. So I just want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about IVI and about the Method Summit and just frame some of the key learnings that we took away from that effort. And then I will be sharing the screen with my co-host, and then we will get into a wonderful panel discussion, which I'm really excited to engage in. So first, for those that may not be familiar, the Innovation and Value Initiative, or IVI, is a 501c3 research organization. Our mission is to focus on both the methods, so the scientific aspect of how we measure and calculate value, as well as the practice thereof. And we are a principle-driven organization. You can visit our website to learn about some of the key principles that drive our work. One of the ways that we really spend time on the practice side is we do a number of convenings every year. We do webinars like this to engage stakeholders from all over the healthcare system. But we also, for the last 2 years, have hosted what we call a Method Summit. And this is focused really on how do we identify the key challenges in scientific methods in cost effectiveness and health economics modeling, and more to the point, how do we identify areas of common ground, areas where there are both shared pain points, as well as opportunities to find solutions that benefit all of us, whether we are a patient or a family member or a patient organization, or whether we are a health plan or a clinician organization. So this is the purpose of IVI writ large. And I'm happy to answer questions more about our work. And I know we will be bringing up some examples during the panel discussion. But in the next few minutes, I just want to share with you a little bit about our Method Summit. We just released the proceedings report, which can be accessed on our website. And you see the link on the bottom of the screen below. And I'm sure one of my colleagues will be posting the hot link in the chat sometime while I'm talking. But just to give you a little background, we organized this Method Summit working with a cross-sectional steering committee, a wonderful group of people that helped us think about who needs to be in the room when that happens. And the organizing theme of the 2021 Method Summit was really building on our 2020 Summit, in which we identified the fact that we are not doing a great job holistically gathering and reflecting patient experience data, caregiver perspectives inside the data that we are all using to think about value. And so using that as an organizing theme, we built the 2021 Method Summit to really dig into, well, what can be done about that now that we've diagnosed that this is a central problem that many, whether payer or employer or health economist, many agreed that this was a central challenge that we needed to unpick the knots. And so the purpose of the 2021 summit was to really say and consider what are all the ways that we can find pathways to improvement. And the Method Summit last year took on a slightly different format given our challenges with virtual format. We held a one-day public forum in which we heard some wonderful inputs from patient organizations. We heard from a keynote from Dana Gelb-Safran with National Quality Forum and others that really laid the groundwork for that discussion. And then we broke out into a series of small group roundtables and then a culminating consensus focused forum. All in all, we brought together over 170 different stakeholders from all across the health spectrum, which was a really wonderful outcome in and of itself. I have one slide to share with you this morning, really to show you some of the key outcomes. And this is a synopsis of what is in the larger proceedings document that I mentioned. So there were really two key domains that the dialogue really focused on. One is really how do we meaningfully and authentically raise the leadership profile of patient and patient communities and helping all of us understand what are those impacts that are really driving their decision-making with clinicians, their experience of care, that drives their choice to engage in their health or not to, whether they're talking about a surgery or a telehealth visit or a pill. So in that domain, some of the key takeaways from our dialogue were that we really do need to do more work and lean into engaging with patient communities to understand what are those impacts and how do they better define research questions as far up the pipeline as possible so that the data that comes out the other end is really reflective of patient experience, because that is a key pain point right now. We also identified that there's important work that we need to continue to do to talk about shared data as a common good as opposed to a proprietary asset. I am not pretending that this is not a complex set of issues that we identified, but I think the main point of the summit was to really identify where there are areas of common ground where we can all lean in to try to identify solutions. These things, making meaningful change happen in any of these areas benefits all of us. We also talked a lot about meaningful engagement of patient communities, making sure that they are viewed as co-authors, co-leaders, co-designers, and also to compensate and make sure that there is a balance of power, if you will, for those patient voices. And lastly, we talked a lot about accountability measures. How do we make sure that funding and publication rights and all of those incentives that really drive the impetus for picking up research or funding research, how do we make sure that they also live the truth of making sure that patients really have a primary role at the table? The other key domain was about how do we improve the methods? This is the bread and butter of the IVI. It's not just about talking about the progress and the principles that need to guide us, but also the complicated math and the tools and the methods that we're currently using to really guide our thinking, guide our balancing of benefits and risks, understanding value, understanding the role of cost, and guiding decision-making, whether it's shared decision-making or regulatory or payer decision-making. And so within that domain, some of the things that emerged were we really need to do a better job of capturing all the economic burdens on patients and caregivers. We've talked too long about caregiver burden. We've talked too long about productivity and impact on work. And we do not have consensus about how to accurately measure and use data that really understands those economic burdens. Happily, PCORI, which was a major funder of our enterprise as well as NEHI's, has an expanded mandate that allows the collection of that data. That's an important step forward. And we look forward to working with them and others to help think through what are those economic burdens we need to capture data on and how do we need to go about it. Another really true north principle for IVI is transparency, because everything we do is in the public domain and open source. And so really, again, thinking about patient data and all of this data as a public good. How do we elevate it to the point where it's not behind firewalls, and that data sharing becomes something that's more easily done to the good of all of us. And then lastly, I will just say within this domain, the big one was, and something that we at IVI are undertaking very vigorously this year in particular, is how do we define meaningful measures that capture social needs and address health disparities. The discussion of value should do its level best to uphold health equity, and not hard code disparities, or worse, make things worse in our decision making. So these are principles that I think are very common. All of us can agree that these are important pain points and areas for common solution development. I think the challenge is ahead of all of us, and I look forward to a panel discussion about this today, is where do we start? Where do each of us have tools and resources and ideas and energy where we can collaboratively work towards solutions? And I think that is really at the heart of why IVI exists, and a reason why I'm really excited to both have this conversation today and hear from our panelists about their ideas. So with that, I'm going to go off camera and hand things over to my colleague, Tom Hubbard. Thanks so much for listening.
Jennifer, thanks so much. I think I'm back on camera here. And seriously, our thanks to Jennifer and the IVI team for this event and the opportunity to collaborate. We, both organizations, participated in each other's conferences with PCORI support, as Jennifer mentioned, and I have to credit Jennifer for suggesting back in the fall, as we were getting into the latter stages of our projects, that there was an opportunity here to trade notes and really discuss some common themes for action going forward. Let me start, just a quick backgrounder on NEHI. I could see in the chat any number of our people from our NEHI member organizations logging in here. We share a number with IVI, which is sort of another reason this is a great collaboration. We are a nonprofit health policy organization headquartered up in Boston, but with a national mission regarding innovation in healthcare. And our membership is sort of deliberately organized around multiple sectors. The original idea of NEHI was to bring patient advocates, payers, providers, pharmacy, academic medicine, biopharma, and so on together around one table. With that, though, let me sort of tag on to what Jennifer just said. Our project was focused, first of all, on the issues around novel therapies as they get approved by the FDA and launched into the healthcare marketplace. And the communication, or more precisely, maybe the gaps in communication that we see between patient communities and payers when that happens. So our project focused sort of one step or two downstream, if you will, from what the IVI project focused on, which of course is relative to the value assessment process. And I, like Jennifer, please forgive me because I'm going to gloss over or sort of elide over some very complex issues here. But I think what frankly we knew we would find, and what came across strongly in the conference we did last July with about 70 folks from patient communities and payer organizations, was that in our system today, there's little systematic communication or little systematic means to have that conversation between a patient community and payers at this time when, in our case, again, novel therapies are launched. Frankly, nobody in our process suggested that that is a product of malign intent or intentional oversight in our system. It's just the way the system has evolved, but it does point to what is now a sort of communication gap between patient communities and payers. This is something that's clearly evolving. It's pretty apparent that patient engagement with value assessment, whether it's with ICER here in the US or with health technology assessment agencies abroad, is a very important, call it checkpoint in this process. And we'd probably be remiss in not mentioning as well that even further upstream, where the FDA and the patient-focused drug development process lives, or even the more informal, organic patient-focused drug development that has been really pioneered by a number of patient organizations around the country, small p, PFDD, if you will, is having a very important role in sort of shaping what is ultimately communicated downstream. But for now, this is a evolving process. There's no clear playbook on this, and that's a reason why we wanted to do our project and why we thought that convening folks to talk about what just the general guardrails, the principles of good communication would be helpful. There's plenty of precedent in the drug development and technology assessment and payer evaluation world for use of or reference to principles. I might point out, early in its life, PCORI enunciated principles of engagement, certainly with research, patient engagement with research. It has enunciated principles of equity and inclusion, specifically with relation to patient engagement with research. If you look at the HTA processes in other countries, there are principles, for example, in Europe that apply not just to HTA, but to the whole life cycle of a medicine, from drug development all the way down to utilization and payment. So what we'd like to think that what we've done is sort of in that vein, putting some principles out there that will shape what is clearly an emerging but very important process going forward. So with that, let me just talk a little bit, and again, I'll apologize for going through this very rapidly, but let me get into the, a little more of the detail of what we came up with so that we can get into this discussion with our panel about where we go forward from here. First of all, participants in our project thought it very important just to state at the outset that there's a number of principles here that relate to trust that really needed to be put front and center. And it's two-way. It's patient groups should aspire to standards of transparency in what they do. Put an asterisk on that because there's lots of complex issues there. Likewise with payers, to the extent that they are serious and can adopt principles of transparency in the decision-making over there, very important as well. I'll note that the principles of fair drug access that ICER has been releasing recently speaks to this directly, among other things. And in general, adopting best practices in patient engagement, which is obviously a very lasting priority for PCORI, is something that ought to enter into this as well. Representativeness, very, very important as well, and clearly related to the trust issues. And this gets to two things. One, what we ended up calling authenticity of the patient representation. It's not that a person who is not a patient, him or herself, or a family member or a caregiver, might not have a very valid point of view or information to contribute, but pride of place is really with patients, family members, caregivers, and the clinicians who serve them every day, frankly, in presenting their real experience in managing their condition and their life from day to day. So, and this plays out in at least two ways. One is heterogeneity, the way we usually use that term in the world that we all live in. Patients respond differently to treatments. There is heterogeneity of treatment response, the ability of both patients and payers to really look for that and represent that is extremely important. But of course, the other issue here really is diversity. And we know, we don't need to get into here maybe the whole history of the underrepresentation of Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, low-income Americans, people that do not have a relationship with the healthcare system, their underrepresentation in the research process and the drug development process, a gap that we're all trying to close. A third bucket that came out of our deliberations was really trying to reach a shared focus amongst patient communities and payers on a commitment to evidence. which maybe should go without saying. Lots of opportunities here to collaborate, for example, on the collection of real world evidence after the approval of a therapy. I want to go, however, to the next bucket, so to speak, which is this bucket on a shared focus on total cost of patient care. And frankly, this came right out of from the floor of our conference last July. We at the staff didn't have enough foresight to think about this. It came directly from patients and payers on the floor of our conference. And it basically, I could summarize it this way, which is, however fitful the movement in American healthcare is towards value-based reimbursement, value-based payment, it does continue. There is a real commitment amongst payers, public and private, towards moving away from fee-for-service towards value-based care. Patients, families, and caregivers have obviously a real stake in this, and it is an opportunity to make common cause with payers. And it could be reflected in the collection of real-world evidence. It could be even reflected in value-based arrangements, outcome-based contracts, for example, to the extent that they will continue to be used by, in this case, pharma manufacturers and payers. And finally, timeliness. And I'll put an asterisk on this one too, because this is clearly an issue that gets to some difficult challenges that we've not yet solved. But suffice it to say, when a novel therapy is approved, there's some real urgency very often in the patient community about time to therapy, getting that therapy. At the same time, this could be a period of time where payers are under a lot of pressure to meet deadlines. They're on one-year budgets. With a lot of insurers, there are strict deadlines that they have to hit. A lot of this exchange, if it's going to happen right now, has to happen in a very compressed period of time. So what we walked away with is there should be an aspiration to making this a timely conversation. But the question, of course, is how we do that. I'll just leave off by saying that I think, like as Jennifer has suggested with the IVI process, this all points to call them structural issues, organizational issues that really need to be focused on going forward. I'll mention 4 that came out of our process real quickly. One is what many patient advocates in our process call demystifying the payer decision-making process. Arguably, as the therapies get more complex, the evaluation and the decision-making gets more complex. We didn't used to have CAR T therapies, so we didn't have a system for evaluating CAR T therapies, and on it goes. A second is, what should be the patient engagement in the decision-making? I mean, should there be direct patient engagement in a pharmacy and therapeutics committee? Should there be direct patient engagement in the utilization management decision-making process? Obviously, easy to say, harder to do. Third, maybe closely related, is there a way to systematize this that just makes it easier, frankly, for patients and providers to, patients and payers to communicate with each other in one fell swoop, in a way. So, right now, patient communities, patient groups have to go through a lot of different doors to find the right people to talk to over in the payer world. Can we find ways to find what you might call common points of entry? And finally, again, this timeliness issue. Can this be done in a way that does not happen when everyone's jammed up with trying to get better time to therapy, but also get decisions made on the payer side in a timely way? So with that, I'll stop. I hope you haven't run over too much. And I'm very pleased to introduce Andrew Hugh as our moderator for this session. In his previous role at PCORI, Andrew was a great help in all of this, and we're glad that in his new role he can join us today and moderate this discussion. So, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Jennifer, for the invitation to join you guys today and for allowing me to moderate this panel. As Tom mentioned, I'm Andrew Hu, Director of Health Advocacy for the Bipartisan Policy Center. Though, as Tom just noted, I think I'm asked here to join you all today because of my prior role with PCORI, where I had the good fortune to work with IVI and NEHI on a number of these issues, and with the ultimate goal of building a more patient-centered health system. So glad to be joining you all again and continuing to advance this discussion. I know for a lot of folks who are on this call, advancing patient-centered principles in the health system is central to the work that you guys do every day. But for many others, I think these concepts are still a little bit abstract and could still use some direction on where else to go and where there's room for improvement. So that's the goal of today's conversation, is to continue this dialogue, reflect how far we've come, in the health system and injecting the patient voice throughout the decision-making process, but also to think constructively on where there's still room to grow, where more we need to do, and what are some of those next steps that everyone should be focused on. So as we have a great group of panelists who can speak to this issue from a wide range of perspectives. You've already heard from Jen and Tom, but joining them on the panel will be Dr. Andrew Crichton, founder of Crichton Consulting Group, Jennifer Graff, Senior Director at AMCP, and Maggie Jalowski, Director of Advocacy at 6Cells. So I want to thank all the panelists and invite them all to hop on screen and hop on camera. And thank you all for taking the time for today's discussion. My goal is to pose a question to each of the panelists, but I do hope that everyone can think on the question a little bit, and please feel free to jump in, offer your thoughts after the first response. I might even jump in and do some follow-ups myself. I know this group isn't shy, so I'm looking forward to a robust and productive conversation. But to start, Maggie, I'd actually hope to start with you, and hope it's not too much of a burden to have you speak for the entire patient population on this panel. But I'd like to get your perspectives on the progress patients and patient advocates have made in achieving a more patient-centered healthcare system, but also on what are the remaining barriers and challenges that the patient groups and organizations still have in making sure the patient voices are heard.
Thank you, Andrew. I know it's a big role to speak on behalf of not just the sickle cell community, of which our advocacy organization really focuses, but also patient advocates at large. So I am thankful for this opportunity to have this platform, and I hope that I can kick off the conversation, but also encourage others to chime in. And I'm noticing increasingly that stakeholders are recognizing the need to meaningfully engage with patients to inform their processes. And I see this and I can give a few examples of the way that this is demonstrated in the work that we do. Almost weekly, our small organization is asked to recruit patients and caregivers to participate in focus groups and roundtable discussions with researchers so that they can ensure their endpoints are relevant to real life patient needs, which I think is a great step forward. We're also seeing the formation of advisory boards, rare disease councils, and they are advising as experts for drug utilization review boards and pharmacy and therapeutic committees, providing really necessary consultation during drug coverage decisions. And this is in part thankful to the work of the other panelists that have defined this as necessary, and it also has helped to the evolution of these principles. And another example is what we had discussed in IVI's Method Summit is there's great work happening in terms of collecting patient preference and really understanding what are those patient important outcomes. Specifically, what this looks like for the sickle cell community is that we're involved in ongoing research efforts and partnerships that have improved the representativeness and ultimately built community trust in data that is now useful for value assessments. And I'm excited to speak a little bit more about this in the discussion. We're also seeing as patient advocates that our organization has been increasingly invited to participate in conversations with policymakers considering cost effectiveness policies, and as well as large payer audiences. For example, we were invited to the annual AMCP conference to discuss patient important impacts for sickle cell, which I feel is a really great step forward. And then most importantly, I see that as patient advocates, we're being looked at as partners in this work, that patient organizations are leading the progress due to this platform given to us by other organizations. But at 6Cells, we look at our collaborations with other patient groups, such as from the hemophilia or community, allergy, asthma, arthritis, HIV, and muscular dystrophy. And we look at those collaborations as being foundational and demonstrating how patient advocates can be taking this lead and how we can be doing this work and informing these processes. But as you mentioned, there are still barriers and challenges that exist for patient advocates in this space. And I can highlight a few examples of what we're seeing. We're finding that there are still areas where active, meaningful engagement is not always conducted. For example, some engagement practices are not effective. One example we see of this is collecting a patient input just to include it in a summary of a report is not closing any gaps in access or outcomes. Additionally, we've had difficulties finding shared goals or developing consensus across groups of stakeholders. And a simple example of this in our work is difficulty finding common language so that we are ensuring not to point fingers or place blame in any way that instead pushes other stakeholder groups from partnership. Transparency remains one of our biggest challenges. Stakeholders utilizing value assessments in coverage decisions need to be more transparent. Additionally, we're finding in our own advocacy communities that we need to be more transparent about the work we're doing. And the best way to do that is really through peer review journals and other publication methods. And then finally, as Jennifer had mentioned in her opening statement, is that equity needs to be prioritized. And we feel that it's not accurately being considered at this point. Without access to real world data and how treatments impact vulnerable populations, value assessments are inaccurately measuring benefit and can result in inequitable denial of access. And so I say all this to still say that I'm hopeful that events like this will help us find new opportunities and develop solutions to move past these challenges. And I look forward to participating in this discussion with the other panelists.
Hey, thanks, Maggie. I mean, that's definitely a lot. I mean, it does sound like we've come a long way for sure. In the since the term patient-centered health system was first introduced and really focused on, or earlier the last several years. But still a long ways to go. Jennifer, either Jennifer or Tom, and Dr. Crane, any other follow-up thoughts or anything you want to weigh in on?
I mean, how can I follow Maggie? You gave great examples of how there's been progress, which is wonderful. I couldn't agree more that the equity issues really need to drive and kind of be the fire in our engine to stay the course on this and to really dig into the problems and try to find the solutions, because they benefit all of us, and that's as it should be. I also think, something that you said, Maggie, really resonated with me, which is, what is value assessment for? I think we have to ask that question. We are, of course, really concerned with the affordability of medications, of surgeries, of hospital stays, of all of those components of healthcare that are so far beyond the reach of too many people. But we're working with half a deck, to paraphrase what Maggie just said. And I think that we're not suggesting that we need to full stop, but we do need to lean into those areas where we have huge gaps, where we're not collecting data that has any match to someone's actual experience of care or disease trajectory or co-occurring disorder. And I think that's a really strong brass ring at IVI. That's what keeps us motivated to really lean into these questions.
And actually, that actually leads me into a good theme that, Jennifer, that you mentioned. I know this is the work that you guys have been doing with the Method Summit over the past couple of years, but what are some of the promising practices for bringing patient experience data throughout this, the innovation life cycle, whether it's drug diagnostics, devices? How do we do that, and what more do we need to do?
I think there's a lot of promising practices. I think but I will say one of the caveats is that a lot of the development of these practices and finding consensus and agreement within research communities in particular is slow going, because we like to do things the way we've always done them. But for example, I mean, certainly we can point to the patient-focused drug development work that FDA has gotten behind, but frankly, let's remember that was largely driven by the patient communities standing up and saying this has to happen, and having an open ear from a major agency that would support that open conversation. But that's obviously a key driver. I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that PCORI has both in funding and in expectation, led the way in terms of engaging patients in research, teaching patient communities how to engage in research, elevating their voice to equal playing field. So that's important work. I think the next horizon there is this notion of how do we understand economic impacts? How do we gather information about caregiver experience? How do we get real with some of the qualitative? I think there was a comment in chat that I saw at the top of the session that said, don't forget qualitative data, of course. And I would say that's something that IVI is working with our partners at PAVE, with RAND, with other organizations to say, what is patient preference? It's not just attitude, and it's not fickle, fly by the seat of our pants decision-making. Patient preferences refers to values, refers to experience, refers to all the moving parts of someone's life that are both impacted by that condition that they're dealing with, but also that inform what is likely to have a best outcome. And we do a really poor job, have done a really poor job in understanding what those factors are and trying to ensure that they're represented in both our research and our decision making. And I think the whole movement in equity, the whole discussion about social determinants of health is a good example of everybody's waking up to the fact that we are not measuring those things correctly. So it's all part of the same package. And I would also, the last thing I would say is there's, on the accountability side, I think there's some interesting movement there, which I'm really excited about. For example, in addition to PCORI asking for patient engagement strategies, we saw ISPOR, the organization that governs health economics and outcomes research, publish reporting standards that say you should be identifying your patient engagement strategy for HEOR research. And not only should you be identifying what engagement strategy you used, you should be identifying how it influenced your research outcomes and your process. That's game changing, in my opinion, as is some of the recent listening sessions and statements by CMMI about equity and about how all of their new models need to demonstrate how those models are accounting for and using engagement strategies and other methods to ensure that equity is represented in that work. Again, this is an exciting time for opportunity. So,
Andrew,
go ahead, Tom.
Maybe just a couple of things just to again tag onto what Jennifer just said. First, that Maggie's points are really interesting here as to how this may tie into patient engagement, tying into the drive for equity. I can say that we NEHI certainly have payer members who are very serious about moving equity goals into value-based payment, and we've seen the same goals enunciated by CMS under the Biden administration. And it's interesting, and now that's, I think, mostly about delivery of probably basic medical services for the most part, but it's interesting to think about the tie over to the kinds of things that are going to come through value assessment, hence IVI's mission, or down into some real P&T or utilization management decision making sort of downstream. That's one thing. I'll also point out, and this is maybe not to steal the thunder of the other panelists, but I know that I explained that our project has been focused on novel therapies, but this is a discussion that doesn't, it can and should apply to other things as well, including diagnostics. We're certainly seeing an increasing role of very advanced but complex diagnostics, for instance, in the oncology area, that bear directly on the patient experience, for sure. But what I ultimately wanted to mention here is, in talking about how do we get sort of more systematic communication with payers, this is where I think we're sort of wrestling with what is always a very evolving and changing set of business practices over in the payer world. And in a lot of ways, in terms of, at least with communication with payers, it gets to how are they organizing the way to make these decisions done these days? So, to the extent that we may be seeing business units, for example, in big insurers or PBMs that are handling all or most of what might be in the oncology field or in complex care, which may be genetic medicine and all of that. That's part of the challenge we've got here, is because we know that these practices are just shifting, and one of the reasons being that the therapies, for example, can be quite challenging scientifically. So
I think you guys both raised some good points about, obviously first off on the front end, being able to better capture this data. And then Tom, as you mentioned, the downstream effects. So I'd actually, and on how the data is actually going to be used. So I don't want to follow up with that and give Jennifer Graff, what are your thoughts? And if you weigh in, how does AMCP and you guys, how do you factor in this type of data into the work that you do?
Right. Thank you. So for those that aren't familiar, AMCP is the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. We represent the people who identify and develop formulary benefits that are part of your healthcare coverage. And so there are standard processes that are already included for things like clinical data, lab data on your HbA1c, whether you avoided a hospital event. And so the more that we can embed patient experience data into that, raise it up to the level, as Jennifer was talking about earlier, publishing, as Maggie suggested, that we can ensure that the patient journey, not only what matters to the patients, what are the outcomes that matter, what is their experience, what's their journey, it helps to bring that to the same level as the other economic and clinical data that health plans are used to seeing. And so I think that's a real opportunity. The other piece is then we need to figure out how to best engage with other groups. And to Maggie's point, how do we ensure that it's not just Maggie as a single person representing all patients or representing all health disparities? So how do we move from, we check the box on patient engaging patients and we had one person engaged, to having other groups? And I think we're still seeing how to best do that. Is it through a beneficiary advisory board like some groups are doing? I know the VA has it. Other groups do have a patient representative on their council or on their formulary P&T. That's a little more challenging to represent everybody. I would imagine that would be a daunting task. We don't even ask our clinicians to do that, to represent nephrology and oncology. That's asking a lot of our patients. We need to figure out better ways to engage with patients, and providing those touch points, I think, will be really key. When do health plans need that information? If I'm making a formulary decision and I'm thinking about my planning, I want to know about it before the drug is approved, 12, 18 months in advance. And then we're going to be making our decisions within 90 days of approval, from FDA approval. So beyond that, the decision's already made to put it on the formulary or not. And so I think one of the key challenges will be, Maggie, as we think about how we sync up payer decisions and when patient organizations have that information, once the formulary decision is made, it's harder to put that genie into a different box, put it back into a different bottle. And so I think the more that we can identify, here's the time points, here's the elements that we're looking for, we'll have better link ups for value, as Tom was mentioning. And then my last point I would just say is, we're still so far in the infancy in this. The types of products that are being developed through patient-focused drug development, I think we'll have much, much different product information available now that the FDA has been engaged in patient-focused drug development. Those products will come with that information. And then the question will be, does it impact the patient? And if it doesn't, then maybe it may not be covered in the same ways as a product that really hits a measure that patients really care about. And, just to put a real fine point, the way I've heard one of our members talk about patient input is it provides color to a black and white picture of clinical data, and it helps them understand whether what they're doing actually matters. And so the more that we can provide that color, the better off we all will be.
So I really like that type of framing. We obviously need to make sure we have the full picture for sure. Now the issue that I know, Tom, you mentioned in your intro, and Dr. Hyde, like you to weigh in on this too, is And Jen, you just touched on this, the timeliness of that. When can we add that color? So Tom, I want to kind of ask you, and you touched a little bit about this in your opening, but how do we achieve that timely patient engagement? With the value assessment process or the payer decision making process, and what did you hear from your groups and your conferences, and Dr. Crichton, from your experience as having worked for a large employer? How do you use that, and how do you build that into the decisions that you make? So Tom, why don't you
want me to start? I think Jennifer Graff just really spoke to this in a good way, that we didn't emerge from our process with, as I mentioned, sort of a playbook on this, or it was more of a sense of emerging experiments and innovations and so on. I don't know if it was Jennifer or who mentioned the rare disease advisory councils that are now in some states, and in some cases working directly with a state Medicaid program or a division of insurance or something like that. I think probably the thing to say is that the field is ripe for some experimentation with this. But the theme is, can you do this in a way that is sufficiently in advance of when actual formulary decisions or utilization management decisions need to be made? How far in advance can you do that? When maybe if it's a therapy, it's not yet approved by the FDA, and that whole picture and the pricing picture may not be clear at that point. I think to the extent that, and I will admit, I don't have a good grasp of this and what may have been happening the last few months, but the extent to which, for example, states are looking to move to a sort of public horizon scanning process because they have global budgeting goals and that kind of thing. They're looking for to do in a more public way, identification of innovations, maybe therapies or diagnostics or whatever coming down the pike. That may be an opportunity to get direct patient engagement in that kind of process. And then last but not least, if there's going to be a value assessment process of a given therapy or other innovation, that does become a checkpoint, a focal point that needs to be considered for patient engagement. And I know it is being considered for patient engagement.
Dr. Crichton, if you can weigh in from your experience as having from the employer perspective, how do you make these decisions? How do you add those color?
Yeah, so it's a bit hard right now because a lot of times the payer decision making is directed from a regulatory process with ERISA, things like that. So it's very formulaic. So the way I look at it is there's a lot of compliance, not necessarily commitment to the patient need. And I think there's a lot of real world data that's available, but not necessarily being looked at as you do the benefit design, as you do the benefit administration. And so I think it's a perfect opportunity to look at changing or adapting the process to get that ongoing feedback. So, you look at the way the benefits are set up a lot of times is for, the mass in the middle. It doesn't take care of the variants, the individuals that do this. And so some of the changes that do need to be made is this thought of flexibility, rapid decision making. So where an appeals can take 60 days, it shouldn't take 60 days for a patient. It should be able to be much quicker in just a few days at the most. Pre-authorization, things like that, can be streamlined to be able to handle the volume. But the other thing too is, as payers, again, being the chief medical officer for a large company, a lot of times we got variance reports at the end of the year, an annual report. I think they need to be just in time. So when somebody is denied or something happens, that needs to be escalated because it's a time to look and see what's working, what's not working. So from my perspective, the process needs to be taken care of. Also, from a benefit design, needs a broader time frame. I think, as somebody said, decisions are made for a plan year. Well, disease and illness do not follow a plan year. So we need to have a broader look at this. And in my experience, it's happened all the time. I had an executive that just churned in the system in the New York area for 3 years, not getting an answer. Sent them to what I'll call a center of excellence for a week, and they walked away with an answer and a treatment plan. If you look at it from a benefit design, that was a very expensive week. Nobody goes back to look at that 3 years of cost and no answer. And that's a much more expensive proposition. And the other thing I'll add at the last minute is a treatment that is given and doesn't work is more expensive than an expensive treatment that does work in most instances.
That's a great point and a great framing to bring to this. And you touched a little bit about the challenges of dealing with variants, right? You do have oftentimes and one that might be stand out, but as your role as chief medical officer for an employer, you do have to factor in population health and how do we design a plan that fits that. But I kind of want to follow up with Maggie or Jennifer Bright, if you want to chime in. As you can kind of tell, there's going to be trade-offs that kind of have to be made, in some of these situations. How do you think patients understand those trade-offs? What are they willing to take? How do we balance those things? And from your perspective, we'll love to get your thoughts. Maggie, if you don't mind.
I would say let Maggie start, and I can maybe reflect on the research side of it.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, because we do recognize that there's a lot going into these decisions, and it's like all of you mentioned, it's impossible to engage every single patient in the plan and across the country to really inform these decisions. So how are we best utilizing the patient experience and incorporating that into the decision making, I think is the primary goal of what we're working for. So I think knowing that ultimately utilization controls need to be applied, that there needs to be coverage decisions made, but how is the patient experience and voice reflected in those decisions? What are the true contributions? So I know that Tom had mentioned this as well, and it's really important to think about what are the changes, what are the impacts that that data or that the experience is bringing to the conversation, what is being changed, and I think also ensuring that, as someone mentioned in the chat, that the diversity of patients is represented as well. So it's not just the most predominant patient advocacy organization that gets to make the decision. Something that we've been working on in our work with partnerships for research is that we have leveraged existing relationships that we have in the community. So looking at community health workers across the country, how can they help support data collection for patient preference in partnership with a pharmaceutical manufacturer that's about to launch their clinical trials, so that we know that true diversity and representativeness is resulting in outcomes that align across the community's wishes and goals. So I think if we get to that point where we see patient engagement at that level, there's a better understanding that patient priorities are being considered, and the recognition that the resulting decisions that are made are reflective of the different priorities that need to be considered.
Mm-hmm.
Again, well said. I would say, in my experience working in patient advocacy communities with a range of disease states over the last 25 years, I've never heard a patient advocate or patient advocate organization say you have to include every single voice in order to be representative. But the smell test, if you will, is all of the things Maggie said, and it's how your mindset of how you go about triangulating. So how do you leverage existing community partnerships? How do you understand it from an organizational, patient structured organizational level? Are there, Facebook communities and other nodes of patient support that offer an opportunity to listen and hear? Are there research organizations or partnerships that can help you. So for example, we're sponsoring a patient preference study that PAVE at the University of Maryland is helping us do. And we've spent almost 6 months recruiting 300 patients with major depressive disorder. And we've done that, and it's been exhausting to some extent, but we've done it for several reasons. We need to make sure that it's representative. It's not all middle-aged white women. We need to make sure that we're reaching socioeconomic levels and geographical diversity, and people with co-occurring disorders. And we've had to not only work with traditional researchers, but even reach out to clinical settings where we can do surveying in a hard copy format, because we're also dealing with issues of connectivity. And nobody should pretend that this is not hard work, and we know that it is. But again, to Maggie's last point, if we want there to be trust and we want patient communities with lived experience to feel that the decisions are inclusive of their experience and their perspectives, we have to do that work. We have to invest in it. And I would say there's a growing cadre that is willing to invest in that, and that is the hope side of it. But there are still too few that are not, who are lurking on the sidelines and saying, well, we'll wait until we see a clear path or a clear method that everybody can get behind. And I would argue, get on the train, because this is the way it needs to go. And I couldn't have said it better, Dr. Crichton. If we spend money on suboptimal, delayed, or wrong care, we have wasted money, and that is in nobody's best interest. So I could not agree more with what Maggie talked about. And I will share one anecdote that was a carry forward from IVI's work in rheumatoid arthritis. And we published a model that's an open source model and freely available to use. But one of the chief challenges is that there's no data for a lot of the things that individuals living with rheumatoid arthritis across ages, across race, across gender, across severity of disease think is important. Pain is a big part of it, but so is the ability to work. So is the ability to take care of your child. So is the ability to have a child while being treated for rheumatoid arthritis. And our data does a terrible job of representing those preferences. And so therefore, both our treatment options, not just drugs, but any treatment options, and our research and our benefit and policy decisions consequently don't match up with people. And so they end up leaving their careers 12 years early, or not having a child, or having to have a family member come in and take care of them for the first year of their child's life because they can't take the medicines that will actually help them. These are the problems that are real. And if we aren't listening and we aren't trying to engage in some way with real people and understanding the problem we're actually trying to solve, we'll just keep throwing money at the wrong thing.
Yeah, I don't think I've been in a number of these conversations, whether on the moderating side or with you all in these conferences, and it seems like we're having a lot of the same conversations. We're making progress, but not always there yet. So I think that was obviously the goal of today's conversation, this panel. So hopefully we took away some lessons learned where we've made some progress, but also where we can keep going. But I do want to make sure that we do get to some of the audience Q&A. So I'm going to pull up a few of those, but for folks who are interested, please do use the Q&A function and add in a question. And I'll actually pose the first one. I can pull it up on my screen. What are people's thoughts about developing value-based metrics when there is such a large subjective piece to patient satisfaction and achieving patient goals? And I think some of you guys spoke about this earlier. How do we reach patients not affiliated with a large group? So anybody want to
Maggie,
jump in?
do you want to talk about that last portion about how we felt? Yeah, that would be
great. That's something that we're thinking a lot about. Specifically, as I described in the beginning when I was talking about our challenges, is we know the importance of having this data published. But also additionally, we know the challenges of using only academic centers. And so how can we incorporate partnership so that when we are doing these data collection efforts, we are sure to be utilizing existing community organizations, including community health workers, but also utilizing expertise at academic centers that can help us with IRB approvals and academic journal submissions. So we at 6Ls have really been stepping into these unique partnerships to think about the ways that we're defining research collaborations, and then specifically looking at tailored recruitment approaches to ensure that we're reaching patients that are not typically affiliated or associated with data from research.
I have a question for you, Maggie. We recently started a claims study, and we posted it into a repository of real world evidence study design. I'm not aware of, but are you aware of any repository or place to post those kinds of study designs that are specifically around patient preferences? Because I wonder whether that would help raise all boats if all patient communities had access to a portal where you could see 6Ls is sponsoring a study on this, Arthritis Foundation study is interested in doing a study on this, where everybody could see what's there, and that could foster collaboration or interest from other patient participants.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but that's exactly why we're involved in these conversations and in memberships like IVI to really learn what are other disease organizations doing. And then we also look at groups like PCORI to recommend what are those engagement strategies that are kind of looked at as principles that we can incorporate into the work that we're doing in our smaller community.
And Jennifer Graff, do you have any thoughts you want to weigh in?
So I'm just in full agreement with all of this and so encouraged by these conversations. So it feels like there's three things that need to happen. One, we need to collect the data. And I know many health plans are already thinking about that, because if we design a diabetes program for a Medicare Advantage program in Southern California, their needs and goals are going to be quite different than if you're looking at a juvenile diabetes population in a state managed Medicaid, right? So some of this is already converging. We need to collect that across all of those groups. Two, we need to connect groups. So groups like IVI, or what you were just talking about, having this synthesis. We hear from our members, well, we might want to engage patients, but you want us to go out and connect on every disease and every population, and oh my goodness, that's way overwhelming. And I don't think that's what any of us are saying, nor is it feasible. And so we have to figure out, how can we serve as connectors? Is there a role for bodies to be, like the matchmaker, if you will, or, for these types of things? And then I guess the third is really linking. How do we link the outcomes that matter to patients to clinical endpoints, to economic endpoints, just like we have to do? Everybody asks, well, why does lowering blood glucose matter? Well, here's how it matters in terms of reduced heart attacks, reduced blindness, amputations, and economic output. We're still at that beginning stage of understanding what patient engagement and input looks like. Is it preferences? Is it expectations? What's in that? But we have to link it to things that really matter. And that'll probably be a longer journey, but the fact that we're having these discussions and there's groups like NEHI and IVI engaging in this, I think we'll be in a much different place in a few years. But if we can collect, connect, and synthesize, we can get there.
Mm-hmm.
Way to soundbite it, Jen. Andrew, Andrew Crichton, I really would love your thoughts on that same question.
Yeah. So that's why I'm muted here. It's hard. I mean, claims data is it's not accurate. Let's just put it that way. I mean, when I was at Prudential and I was actually on the board of the Arthritis Foundation, we did a study looking at DMARD compliance, and our HEDIS scores looked wonderful as a company. But when we looked at the fill rates and everything like that, it was horrible. So what data are you collecting? And then you get into the patient preferences. That's nowhere in claims data at all. It's hardly even probably not even in the electronic health records. So is there some standardization that we can do of, I'll just throw out 10 questions that can go across all diseases that would bring in the patient preference, the outcomes that the patient's looking for that can be standardized and go from there, then you can kind of bring everybody more together. But I think leaving it to the electronic health record and the claims is not going to be sufficient.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out a project that IVI and others are involved in that National Health Council is spearheading. It's called the patient-centered core impact sets, but that's really what it's driving at. We have core outcomes, but it's trying to broaden that notion out to include financial impacts and life impacts and other things that are relevant, and not to measure every down to the grain of sand, but how can we prioritize? Where can we identify common things like pain or ability to work that cuts across disease states and patient experience, and is important enough that it needs to be resident everywhere? And if we can find consensus about what those top 10 are, I hope it's within our career span that we're able to do that.
I mean, I'm glad that this conversation kind of just naturally veered there, because that was a question from the audience. You know, how do we meaningfully, capture that type of qualitative data and bring that color? You know, as Jennifer, you mentioned earlier. One question that I wanted to kind of pose to you all, and maybe this is for Dr. Crichton or Jennifer or some of the payers. You know, I think everyone in this room, this panel, on this webinar, kind of all understand, the concept and the value of patient engagement and why we need to collect this data and collect this information. But, we don't want to be talking to each other in this echo chamber all the time. How do we make sure, that CFO or the actuary or the folks who are designing benefit plans, how do they understand this value? How do we make sure that they see that and why it's important to incorporate all this patient experience and patient expectation into their decision making? So open that up to the group. Jennifer Bright, if you have an initial thought. Yeah.
I would say, piggybacking on Maggie, keep expanding your circle, keep leveraging the existing relationships you already have. And I think that's one of the fundamental values that we're trying to bring through all of our convenings, is not usual suspects. Who do we need to get to? Who needs to hear about this? It's not just CMOs. I agree with you. It needs to be benefit officers. It needs to be PBM decision makers. And so that's what you have to think, who you're trying to get to, and who do you know right now that can help you get closer to that person. It's classic grassroots and grass tops thinking. But it's hand-to-hand combat, people. You got to just do it.
Yeah, Andrew, I think this is what, for me, connects back to the point that I think of as in terms of how to understand business practices in the payer world. I mean, we famously or infamously have many multiples of payers in the U.S. healthcare system, and we have a lot of intermediaries very often in between. Leading up to whoever is actually signing the check for the health benefit, let's say, at the end of the day. And as I mentioned before, I think one of the things that sort of intrigued us in our process is, and I can't claim that we got into this too deeply, and I can back this up with data. This is the kind of thing that I scanned the AMCP journal for, for data and insight on, is this sort of point that as, for example, therapies get more complex scientifically, then it's a bigger challenge of evaluation, and therefore a bigger challenge in terms of the decision-making chain. So an employer at the end of the line, like Dr. Crichton, was, these days there may be, right, Dr. Crichton, I mean, several layers of, many hands that sort of touched whatever the packet was that ended up in front of the employer in making a recommendation for formulary placement or the benefit design or something like that. That's a really hard thing to keep up with. I mean, to echo what Jennifer Bright just said, but I think it seemed to us that that's something that really has to be treated as a serious issue, and maybe part of the research agenda. There may be Andrew, maybe stepping right up to that line that Congress redrew for PCORI with the reauthorization. But that's really, what's at stake here is understanding what those decision-making processes are in the payer world.
So this has been go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll chime in. I think, especially for the business leaders too, you've got to show a broader business impact. So people will look at medical costs, they may look at pharmacy costs, they're looking at silos. You've got to broaden that out on the impact of business. And that's where the health and productivity measurements come in, because one decision may, make sense from a medical cost standpoint, but horrible on the productivity standpoint. You can't get people back to work. And I think having that broader view, and my success has been when a leader is going through a health issue, is being able to have that broader conversation, because they're experiencing it. They're understanding how the system may not be working that efficiently, and you can have those conversations too.
Perfect. So I know we're running short on time, so we'll do one quick closing question, and we've already touched a lot about this in the conversation, but if you guys, from your perspective, can highlight one concrete next step, that we can take that would improve patient focus and decision making, whether it's at the discovery innovation phase, value assessment, coverage, or even at point of care, what would that be, and how can we do it better than we're doing now? And Maggie, why don't we start with you, and then go to Jennifer Graff, Dr. Crichton, and then Jen and Tom, if you guys can wrap up.
Well, I think it's opportunities like this for really having different stakeholder groups come together and have these discussions. So that's really what we're working on. I know at 6 Cells, and I hope across patient advocacy at large, we're looking for opportunities where there are shared goals. And I know a lot were discussed on this call. Health equity is a huge piece, looking at productivity measures and economic burden, the total costs in at large, and incorporating the patient experience. So we're coming to the table to hopefully remove the echo chamber by looking at those shared goals and determining the best way forward. So I guess just to close it out, I'm excited for any potential partnerships. So please feel free to stay connected with us at 6 Cells and the other patient advocacy organizations that I am hopefully representing today as well.
I would just echo what Maggie had to say. The best way to move things forward is usually to break bread together and to sit and learn, across the table from one another. And so I think the one really tangible piece would be, who are you going to reach out to? And having that hub to synthesize who are the patient groups to engage with, and when and how from the payment value assessment, when to engage. The more that we can synthesize that, the better off we'll all be.
So I think that one of the big parts is trying to find these data elements in a lot of various areas, whether it's a clinical research trial, whether it's benefits administration, things like that, and try to find a few champions that will be innovative and take this on, and then let them tell their story over and over again. And so I think it's going to be just piecemeal right now, but there's so many various buckets where we can get valuable data to be actionable.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Bright and Tom, you guys want 1 minute each?
Yeah, so I would say that the tie-in from all three prior comments is act. Do something today. It's look at your data and say, where are we seeing problems or outliers, and who does that lead you to talk to? If you're a patient group, sit down and identify what are your 3 common areas about patient experience that are not well represented in data. Who can you talk to help you codify that? Or is there existing research, or can PCORI be helpful? But start from where you are. And that's broadly message to everybody on this call. We all have a role to play, I would say, is the other part of my answer. So it's not just do something, it's also do from where you are, but don't sit on the sidelines, because if nothing else, this is a common issue. We all have concerns about it, and we all have a role to play in solving it. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say, get involved in what IVI is doing in whatever way is meaningful to you. We are working on these problems to collect information about patient preferences, to prioritize, to talk about methods, to showcase those methods inside open source models, like the one we're working on major depressive disorder, to look across therapeutic options. Even if that's not the disease state that your highest interest is, the methods and the process and the way we're going about it is what we envision the future of this being. It has to be crowdsourced, it has to be forward thinking, and it has to be patient driven. So if that resonates with you, I urge you to come talk with us about research partnership, about getting involved in whatever way, because we all do it together. Tom, you get the last
Tom,
one.
closing word.
Closing words. Thank you again to IVI for this opportunity. Thank you for everybody who listened in today. I could see the names flashing by, and a lot of names of folks who were really active, I know, in our project, and I think in IVI's project as well. And maybe I'll just wrap up by, first of all, thank you. We would welcome hearing from all of you. I'll certainly be looking at the chat and the questions, which I haven't been able to pay a lot of attention to over the last hour or so. But I guess the last note I'd say is, we're talking about good problems to have, looking back over history. I mean, these issues are being raised because the opportunities for meeting serious unmet medical need are just so much larger than we've ever seen before. They raise very complex and difficult issues, but I'll just echo, what I think we heard from the floor of our conference, which was resolve on both the patient folks and payers, albeit and Jen Graff and I talked about this the other day, maybe a little bit of a self-selected group of payers, but payers who are sincerely looking at how to get to yes on these questions and not get to a sort of reflexive no. So, please do be in touch.
Well, thank you everybody on the panel and the audience for taking the time today. Really appreciate, all your efforts in the space, and clearly more work to be done, but we'll leave there, and everyone have a good rest of the day.
Wonderful to see everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.